everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. So with the coronavirus going around and all the chaos with social distancing, we've decided that we're just going to start bringing more content online. And in the coming weeks, we actually hope to do some more live interviews with you guys. We'll have special guests on. We want to cover all of the topics from men and women who have experienced those unexpected pregnancies, have maybe even had an abortion in their story, to the politics and the legislation side of things, and then we'll even hop into the fostering and adoption world. So we hope that you continue to tune in and check out what we're talking about tonight. Our first topic is pro-life apologetics. It's something we all really need to have a good grasp on. When you go out into the world and you say you're pro-life, you need to be able to back that up. And this is just sort of that first stepping stone to understanding that. But before I get ahead of myself, let me first introduce myself. My name is Ashlyn Miller, and I am the marketing director for the Life Initiative and Family Restoration at Watermark Community Church. This is a picture of my family. So I live with my husband, Logan Miller, and our two kiddos, Braun Miller and Emmeline Miller. So they're 3 and 1 year old right now, and they definitely keep my hands full, especially being at home these days. We do a lot of swimming in the pool, playing outside. My son's obsessed with cars and wheels and anything with an engine, and my little girl just started walking. So we're very busy these days.
Yeah, awesome. And my name is Bruce Kendrick. I'm the director of Life Initiatives. This is my family, and we've been a foster adopted family for the past 15 some odd years. We've got 9 kids, 8 of them are pictured here. And so excited to just share some of our story and our experience, but mostly talk about the pro-life apologetics that we've learned and that I've learned as I've joined staff at Watermark, and as we've started to think through what it really means to be pro-life and unpack some of those details. And so excited to be with you and looking forward to what's ahead.
That's awesome. Really quickly though, before we begin and jumping into the whole apologetic side of things, I just wanted to say that the things that we talk about tonight, keep them in your back pocket for those conversations with classmates and coworkers. But if you're ever faced with the instance where you have a friend or a family member who trusts you enough to come to you in their time of need, that's not the time to pull out everything you know about human embryology or any of the apologetics we're going to talk about. That's the time that they're looking for somebody to meet them with love and compassion in probably one of the toughest days of their life, just to meet them with truth right there and to love them in that moment. So like I said, save this for your classmates, your teammates, those, wonderful people on all of your social media who want to have a good argument. That's what this is for. So with that, let's get started.
Yeah, those people that jump right in. And so, again, when we talk about apologetics, what we're not saying is we want to equip you to always be right, because we want to make sure that we're looking at passages like 2 Peter 3:15, which says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, and do so with gentleness and respect. And so what we're not equipping you to do is be that guy or that girl online or in person who is just trying to get sort of the last word in, or the gotcha, if you will. And so we want to be winsome, we want to be kind, but mostly our objective for tonight is to make sure that you're equipped and informed to have that loving conversation that is both salted with truth and with love as you engage those around you. So we certainly are open and want to be willing and equipped to address the needs and choices of women and politics and racism and poverty and immigration and any other issue that might be related to abortion. But if we lose focus on really what's most important, we find ourselves chasing a lot of rabbits. And so we want to make sure that we remain focused on what is really the critical question when we're engaging in apologetics related to the pro-life issue, related to abortion. And that is, what is the preborn? And so this is true with people who are pro-choice, and it's true with people who think they're pro-life. Because there are a lot of people that maybe aren't as holistic in their approach, or just people that haven't thought through all the implications of some of their positions. And so since this is the Life Initiative at Watermark and the ministry that we lead to engage our church, engage our community in caring for women and men with unexpected pregnancies and past abortions, it's only appropriate for us to talk about what the Bible says and what the Bible doesn't say. So let me see if I can pull up this next slide for you and help us think really critically about what the Bible actually has to contribute to this, because there are certainly some things that the Bible doesn't have. So the Bible does not use the word abortion. The Bible doesn't precisely say when life begins, but the Bible does speak in Genesis 1:26 through 28, stating that God created mankind in his image. And this really is the foundational concept that places value on every single one of us as human beings. It's why we would say, hey, from the point of fertilization all the way until the point of death, we want to value the life of every living human being and care for them well, recognizing that they are given the dignity of life and surround them with what they need, and not simply just go, hey, you're kind of on your own. You'll figure it out along the way. And so Genesis 1:26 through 28 is a foundational passage we can all refer to. The one that really struck me, I think I grew up in sort of a conservative, Southern Baptist, Christian kind of culture, but didn't really know some of these passages. And so the one that has really struck home most for me was Exodus 21:22 through 25. And this passage effectively says that if you have two people that are fighting and they accidentally strike a pregnant woman, they're to pay a fine for whatever the husband demands and the court allows, assuming there is no serious injury. And then it kind of takes a turn where it says, but if there is serious injury, you're to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So it doesn't deviate from whether that serious injury is to the mother or whether that serious injury is to the preborn child. But it clearly states that there is justice demanded for preborn life, that God starts there. So Proverbs 24:11 is another great passage that says, rescue those who are being led away to death and hold back those that are stumbling towards the slaughter. Jeremiah 7:30 through 31, God says, look, it was never in my mind, it never even occurred to me that you would sacrifice your children as the Jews who were turning to Molech were taught to do. And so that passage speaks to that. I've had people come to me and go, well, what about Isaac? And man, there's really some interesting things going on in the story of Abraham as God leads him to go sacrifice Isaac, to basically say, hey, that you can't have any idols, including your own biological son, that are ahead of me. And God ultimately intervenes and says, don't hurt the boy. I've provided a lamb. And so for those people that kind of turn on you and go, hey, what about Isaac, in kind of a gotcha way, what God's actually showing us there is the sacrifice of Christ for our sins and redemption. It's not about child sacrifice. God's actually showing Abram that he's not like the other gods of that time. And so lastly, in Luke 1:44, you've got a passage that talks about John the Baptist leaping in the womb of his mother Elizabeth as Mary, who is pregnant with Jesus, comes into the room. And so just speaking to the preborn personality and responsiveness that God has ingrained in us with the image that he has given us, reflecting his goodness and his gosh, I'm trying to think of maybe the word for it, but just the value that God's placed on us there. And there are a couple of problem passages in the Bible that we should be aware of as well. So Numbers 5 talks about a situation where a wife is unfaithful to her husband, and effectively there's this sort of weird incident in the Bible that I don't think a lot of us would resonate with today, but it says that she was to drink sort of this potion, if you will, and that was to empty her womb. Now, the only biblical translation that has ever associated that with an intentional miscarriage is the NIV. All other biblical passages have actually associated it with infertility, and that being the consequence of a wife who was unfaithful. And then Leviticus 17 and Genesis 2:7 are two other passages that seem to come to mind on occasion as people are like, well, when does life begin? How do we know? If we look at the Bible it seems to allude to the idea that life begins when God breathes life into Adam there in Genesis 2:7. And so does life begin when we have breath? Or does life begin when we have blood, as is evidenced in Leviticus 17, where it says that the blood is the life? And so those are both unique passages, I think, that are one specific to the sacrificial system and the other specific to Adam being created, that is not being replicated in the same way. It's not like God forms us all out of the dust, breathes life into us, and then we're automatically a man. And so just things that I think are really important to think about and be aware of. Certainly there are other passages that we might talk about when we think about the value of every human being, but those are the big ones. And so I'd encourage you to be thoughtful as you kind of think ahead and process what the Bible actually says and then what the Bible doesn't say. So that's what I've got to kind of get us started and help you build a foundation.
Yeah, and I would really encourage you guys to actually go back and look up those passages and read them for yourselves, and then probably compare it with what you thought when you read it and what Bruce just said, just to really get a great grasp on it. But from there, let's jump ahead and segue into the SLED acronym. Some of you may have heard this before. It's SLED. So the SLED acronym. And to begin with, we'll start with S, obviously, and that one stands for size. You'll hear a lot of people, especially in the very early, like first trimester pregnancy, say, well, you know, it's so small. Like it can't be human. It doesn't even look like a human yet. It's so small. But if you were to take that argument and compare it to a toddler is also very small and definitely not the same size as a teenager or an adult, but that doesn't devalue the toddler's life. Still very much full of value, fully human, and that's the same for the preborn, no matter what stage of pregnancy the preborn is in.
Yeah, I think something that's come to mind for me on that is just because we tend to devalue people who are smaller than we are, as we just think of somebody who is weaker. And yet in that mindset, I think what we should be driven to isn't pity, but is consideration, and is the diversity of how God's created us. But size is one of those like real simple, like, hey, duh, we don't base someone's humanity based on how big or small they are, how tall they are, how skinny or fat they are. And so that's a great point, I think, just start out with. The second one is the L in the SLED argument, and that stands for level of development. And so typically what we mean and the way that we nuance that, or the way that people tend to think about it, is you've probably heard this before. We talk about it just being a clump of cells. And so the reality is that the human experience, the human life begins at the point of fertilization. And we'll talk about how we know that here a little bit later. But we have ourselves initiated as with unique human DNA from the point of fertilization. We then develop and grow into an embryo, or are an embryo there. We then are a fetus, and then we are born and exit the womb, and we are an infant, and then we are a child, and then we are a teenager, and then we are an adult, and then so the point being that just because at one stage of development we are at our earliest stages doesn't make us not human, doesn't mean we have not been ingrained with the image of God then. And I've heard people say, well, we don't even have brains then. And typically it's sort of it doesn't even have a brain then, or it can't feel pain yet. And yet there is not a single one of us who can go back to a certain point in time prior to fertilization and go, oh, that's when I began. Or post-fertilization to say, oh, that's where I became a human being. We were human from the point of fertilization on, and we continue to develop and grow even to today. And so a decent counter argument around the whole it's just a clump of cells is, well, we're just a clump of cells today if that's just a clump of cells. And then additionally, just people that I've talked to where I honestly kind of spun around on this one of like, hey, I'm trying to make sense of that in my head. I want to be consistent. I want to be thoughtful. I don't want to just respond in sort of this overly spiritualized kind of mentality in my apologetics. And so the argument has been made about how abortion might be equivalent to a natural miscarriage. And I think it's a false parallel there. But the primary point that I think is needed to be made is a miscarriage is a natural occurrence, and God doesn't give us permission. He doesn't say, hey, you can step in. He mentions and states very clearly in Exodus 20 or in any of the times where he's listing out the 10 Commandments, hey, you're not to kill. You're not to take life. You're not to take innocent life. And so that's the L of this sort of framework of SLED that hopefully as you're having some of these conversations, you're going, gosh, are they making an argument from how big or small an embryo or a fetus or a child is, or are they making an argument from a point of level of development and how you can respond appropriately there?
Yeah, for sure. I think something that stuck with me on the point of level of development, and this is just like a simplified explanation, is when you think of a toddler, a little girl, she can't have kids yet. You can't have kids as a woman until you're much older. So it's not just a level of brain development either. Some people like to play that game like, oh, well, a 20-year-old can be, more mentally developed than a 40-year-old given their life circumstances. And that can be true, but it's not just a mental development. Yeah. So we're constantly developing throughout life, mentally and physically. And therefore, like you said, there's no difference for the preborn. So let's jump to the next one. And that's E for environment. And a lot of people like to play this card. You've probably heard it a lot, especially around the discussion recently with the New York law through third term, late term abortion, and people saying that the preborn's not a human until after they've been born. They're not in the world yet. Their environment is different. So their environment excludes them from having the same human rights that everybody else has. And this is another obviously that can't be right, because if, again, you take that toddler and you put the toddler in a different environment, yeah, sure, maybe they can walk to a different room, or if they're in a pool, they can climb out of a pool. But being in a pool or in a different room doesn't change that toddler's value as a human. They still have complete innate human value despite their environment, and the same is true for the preborn. A trip down the birth canal does not make you human.
Yeah, love it. I don't know that I have anything to add on that, but just to kind of double click on that point of, moving 4 to 6 inches down the birth canal. You were human prior to that, and you are still human after that. And it's been remarkable, some of the things that we've invented. And we certainly, as we kind of plow through this, we certainly don't want to prop up the idea that pro-choice people are, just completely overlooking some of these truths or not thoughtful at all. I think there have been some decent arguments that have been made, but it certainly lacks consistency. It definitely lacks a dedication to the scientific objective truth that we know. And then obviously it completely abandons biblical truth. And so, we've just got to be wise as we continue to think through these. So the last one that we'll mention is the D in SLED, and that is degree of dependency. Sometimes it's also associated with desirability. And so we just want to make the point that a person being dependent upon another person does not remove their humanity. So oftentimes, I think probably the most common argument that we hear from the pro-choice side is about bodily autonomy and what's in my body is in my control. And yet, this is a situation where you really don't have other parallels. So it's not like we can go, well, this is like. And so I know that during the Roe v. Wade situation, I've heard people kind of go, well, they tried to use this sort of illustration. I've heard people talk about sort of an employer-employee kind of relationship. And there's just not that kind of parallel here. And so I've even heard people use something like an embryo or a fetus as like a parasite to its mother. And obviously, that's a tragic perspective. But of the many things that's wrong with that, a parasite is not birthed by its same species and then grown up within it. It's just like the parallel doesn't work. So I'm not articulating that particularly cleanly and clear, but I think you get the point. And then when it comes to desirability, we hear just sort of that I'm not ready or I don't want to be a parent. And at no point in time along any of these things that we've mentioned in SLED has that ever been justification for ending the life of another human being. And that's ultimately what we want to hold to. Again, when we go back to that question of what is the preborn, that's what we're driving at. It's not that we're not compassionate towards women. It's not that we don't understand some of the complexities or that you may even have a young mom who's not ready to be a parent. It's just that at no point in time would we have any equivalent to going, oh, okay, well, if you're not ready to do that, then it's okay to murder someone. And so it's important for us to just use the SLED argument as a framework. It's not like something that we would unpack with others to go, okay, well, let's then talk about SLED. Let's talk about what the S means. And it's going to have to be more relational and more conversational than that. But SLED is a great tool to have in your tool belt as you just process through what are the main points that somebody's arguing towards and how you can redirect that back towards the primary question of what is the preborn.
Now that you guys have all learned about SLED and we've gone over a couple of the common arguments you'll hear from the pro-choice lobby, let's move on to two more of the really important questions that we need to answer. And that is, how do we know when life begins? And how did we get here?
Yeah, that's really good. So we're throwing up a chart right now that's called the Carnegie chart. This is developed by our friends at Contend Projects. Their organization out of DC that really just helps bring embryology to middle school and high school classrooms, biology classrooms, and just goes, hey, let's just teach what the science says. So we've actually known since the late 1800s that life begins at fertilization. And there's some nuances in there that are a little tricky and a little subversive from the abortion industry that I think we can talk about here in a second when we look at kind of the rise of birth control and abortion. But the Carnegie chart really just spells out it's human embryology. The Carnegie stages were developed back by the Carnegie Institute in 1940s, and just kind of went, hey, this is how we know and how life develops during the embryonic period. And so from the very beginning, Carnegie stage 1, a human being begins at fertilization. And so these numbers that you kind of see up there are measurements in millimeters of the greatest length of the embryo, that first stage that's actually called the primordial embryo. And there at day 5 or 6, kind of number 4 stage there on the chart is when implantation begins. And so it's not like you have just a fertilized egg in between stage 1 and stage 4. What you have is a embryo, a new human being with unique human DNA that is all their own, totally separate from mom and dad, that deserves life and that we can distinguish as their own human being. And so that's what's unique and interesting about this, is just to say, hey, we've known that human life begins at the point of fertilization since the late 1800s. We've just been ignoring it and not been consistent in our legislation or in our discussions around sex ed and things like that. In some ways because we're human and oftentimes we just kind of want to do what we want to do and do what's convenient to us, which has really been, some of the primary reasons why women have abortions. And then secondly, Ashlyn, I'll let you kind of jump in here. We put together this timeline to just look at some of the major events that happened that led us to where we are today. And so, Ashlyn, I don't know if there's one specifically that kind of sticks out to you that you're just like, yeah, I didn't know this beforehand looking at it, but as I've learned more, as I've been more involved with the Life Initiative, this is one or two that have really stuck out to me. I know there are a handful on here that have stuck out to me, but I'll kind of leave this up and let everybody read through this as you kind of think about what were some of the major things that happened along the way, both historically and in sort of the political movements as well as the thing that most of us don't have context for, and that's the eugenics movement. So before I go any further, Ashlyn, anything that sticks out to you?
Yeah, I would have definitely grabbed the 1883 eugenics movement, and then jumping ahead almost a century to the 1960s invention of contraceptives, like the birth control pill, basically as we know it today. And of course, I knew at some point, obviously that had to have been invented, but growing up, it was always a thing. Like my friends took it, even in high school. So I had never really considered a time before that or how the invention of that had impacted the abortion industry, the pro-life industry, and I definitely didn't know the root of it from the eugenics movement. That's probably what I've learned the most being involved with the Life Initiative, just how big of a movement the eugenics movement was and how much that plays into the abortion industry, even still today.
Yeah, so. Yeah. I think one of the big things that stuck out to me was Alice Paul's statement. So she was one of the original authors that contributed to the women's suffrage movement and the 19th Amendment that was passed in 1920. And she was one of the leading feminists of her day. And she's the one who said, look, abortion is the ultimate exploitation of women, which just blew me away because I've always associated feminists with the abortion industry or the abortion movement or the pro-choice movement. And so it wasn't until like the 1970s or late 1960s when you had the National Organization for Women that really became influenced by the eugenics movement, that we see that shift where women go, yeah, we've got to be able to have abortions in order for us to be free. And so you see in 1965, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, ACOG, defined conception to begin at implantation. And the reason that they did that in 65 was because they needed to be able to sort of change the public's perception on when life began. And so many of us use the phrase now, life begins at conception, life begins at conception. But the reality is that life doesn't begin at conception according to this definition and the definition that's still being used today, which is at implantation. Life actually begins at fertilization. And if you back up to 1959, at a meeting with Planned Parenthood and the Population Council, which was a eugenics organization funded by the Rockefellers, there's a doctor there named Bent Boving who stated that the social advantage of being considered to prevent conception rather than to destroy an established pregnancy could depend on something so simple as a prudent habit of speech. And so it was strategically their effort to change the way that we talked about pregnancy to then be able to utilize contraceptive pills. And the same thing's really true today. Like, we don't think of abortion as anything other than like partial birth abortion or late term abortion. But if you go back to the point that life begins at fertilization, anything that we're encouraging a woman to inject into her body that is then impacting that, that is preventing implantation or that is causing, obviously an abortion, that's abortion, right? And so we don't think of it in those terms. And
can you slow down and unpack that a little bit, Bruce? Because I don't want that point to be lost. I think so many people are so comfortable with birth control that they don't really understand the abortifacient side of it.
Yeah. So effectively, you have a handful of different ways to prevent pregnancy. And one of those is barrier methods, condoms, and sponges and diaphragms and things like that. You've got then short-term, kind of temporary birth control options, contraceptives, and a lot of those are things like the contraceptive pill, which is admittedly like one of the most widely used and has been talked about as like, this is this incredible invention. And in some ways it is. Like, I do want to recognize that there have been advances in medicine and that has brought about something. And yet what it's really brought about as the contraceptive pill was invented is an abortifacient, where we've just kind of been lied to and fooled into believing like, oh, we're preventing ourselves from getting pregnant, when there actually is a strong possibility, and in many ways, not just a possibility, a probability, that what we're doing is preventing implantation and not fertilization. And so even some of those long-acting contraceptives that are like IUDs or the shot or the implant or things like that, even those will either prevent ovulation, and if they don't prevent ovulation, then they will thicken the cervical mucus in order to keep sperm from getting to the ovaries or the fallopian tubes to then implant the egg or fertilize the egg. And then if they don't prevent fertilization, then what they do is they thin the lining of the uterus. The hormones that are in those contraceptives thin the lining of the uterus to effectively turn it into kind of this slip and slide, which is not a great illustration. I just don't know how else to talk about it. I mean, it'd be like if you were jumping off a building and you had this huge inflatable pillow there to catch you, and somebody pulled that pillow out from under you and put a literal pillow like you have on your bed and said, good luck. And so there is some intentional component to those contraceptives to actually prevent pregnancy from implanting. And that's where we get into the abortifacient aspect of that. I think the last thing that I'll say on that I truly find really conflicting, especially as somebody who has daughters, who obviously has a wife and is going, hey, I want what's best for my daughters. I want what's best for my wife. That men have been given the same types of contraceptives using the same types of hormones to prevent sperm from being released and and men routinely have gone, you know what, I just couldn't take the mood swings. I couldn't take the effects to my body. And so they basically just backed up and said, no, the women can do it, which is crazy to me. Absolutely crazy that we're putting this on the backs of women to prevent pregnancy and effectively lying to them. And so many OB-GYNs are just kind of like, hey, you know, if you have something wrong, here's birth control. Even if it's not related to not getting pregnant, here's birth control. It seems to always be sort of the solution. Never mind the fact that we're encouraging women to put hormones in their bodies that sometimes don't belong there at all, and sometimes is a heightened release of those hormones that impact all kinds of other things that we really shouldn't be. So, yeah, lots of crazy thoughts on that. We've actually got a one-pager on our website. If you go to the lifeinit or watermark.org/TLI, there's a one-pager about birth control there that we'd encourage you to read, especially those of you who are married and, you know, thinking about family planning, or getting married, thinking about family planning and kind of next steps there. So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry to take us, you know, into a little wormhole there, but I didn't want that to be glossed over. And that just like mentioning the whole male birth control that you just said, it's like, why don't we talk about that when it comes to women's rights and, you know, equal rights and the feminist movement? It's like, where's that discussion? But we'll save that one for now. I think now would probably be a good time to jump into some of the questions that you guys sent in. So a little Q&A here. The first one that we heard a lot of, and you guys have probably heard this from people before too, is abortion justified in the cases of rape, or if the mother's life is at risk? And how would you unpack that, Bruce?
Yeah, I think, so one, obviously, we want to be compassionate towards rape victims and not just sort of dismissively go, hey, well, you know, you should just put up with, you know, whatever for the sake of the life of this child. And yet, I think the reality is that abortion is continuing violence. And so it's not solving the rape. It's not making that right. That's not justice. It's not sort of an eye for an eye type of thing, because the preborn child is not the offender in this. They're not the perpetrator in this. And so I certainly resonate with a woman who just go, hey, this is hard. I don't think I can raise this child. And at the same time, and what a tremendous act of love and I think just response and reflection to go, hey, this violence was acted out on me, but I refuse to act that same violence out on someone else. And we do want to make sure that justice is served. I do think there should be stronger penalties for perpetrators of rape. And yeah, certainly one of those things that we just go, hey, this is wrong. And I would even tie it back to the kind of culture and short-sightedness that we had back in the 60s and 70s and the sexual revolution, where we just went, yeah, pornography is great. It's fine. Nobody's getting hurt. The reality is that people are getting hurt. Men and women are getting hurt. The preborn child is obviously getting hurt when they're aborted. And so that's how I think about that. Stephanie Gray came and did a Real Truth Real Quick with Todd Wagner, our lead pastor at Watermark, that I think is really helpful and winsome as you think through how to engage with people on that topic specifically. And so I'd encourage you to go check that out. We'll have a link with some more resources on it here in a minute when we kind of get done with some of these questions.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you look at history in any instance of discrimination, it's always a more powerful body of people or person enacting harm on a smaller person. So if you go down the chain of events, one person, most likely a man, raping a woman who ends up pregnant, ending that in abortion, you're just continuing that chain of pain. And a lot of the research does show that the women who choose abortion in those cases still feel more pain after that. It doesn't fix the problem. So it's not a solution to the rape. So again, definitely compassion for that woman. Meet her with love and truth right where she's at. But abortion's not the answer. And then the second half of that question, addressing when the mother's life is at stake, a lot of people like to use that argument. And the real truth of it is that very, very rarely is that actually the case. From a health standpoint, life or death standpoint, very rarely. And of course, in that instance, we're not saying the baby's life is worth more than the mother's life. Not at all. If you need to just save the mom, save the mom. The one instance in which that jumps to mind for me is when you have a pregnancy that develops either in the fallopian tube or on the outside of the uterus, in which case the pregnancy is not viable and would lead to harm and complications down the road for the woman. Do you know of any other instances, Bruce? That's the only one that I know of.
I don't. I think some of the situations that have been brought to my attention have been like in uterine diagnoses of like chromosomal disorders and things like that, where people have been like, hey, look, this child's not even going to survive 24 hours after they're born. We might as well terminate them now. And we have friends who have had those kinds of diagnoses and who have admittedly just endured through that and gone, look, we read our Bibles, we trust God, and we know this may be one of the hardest experiences he ever asked us to walk through, but we cannot take the life of our child. And so we're willing to endure that 24-hour period, 48-hour period, 2-week period, whatever it may be, to care for this child because we value life. And in some cases, we've talked to people where they've gone, yeah, our doctor made a mistake and the baby was perfectly fine and normal. And so, I appreciate the concept of a mother's life being at risk and wanting to protect her. But I think the reality that we're seeing is that's being used by doctors, that's being used by women to mean all sorts of things. And so I would caution legislators from kind of following that mindset and using it as the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, for sure. Another question that popped up that I would say is maybe a little bit newer in the discussion is, should women who have abortions be criminalized, and what is mens rea? Yeah,
that's a great question. So we were a part of a bill here in Texas recently that was actually set up to kind of correct some of the contradictions in our state, and it criminalized women. So it effectively said, look, the law currently in Texas says that the only people who are exempt from the law for killing a preborn child are the preborn child's mother and an abortionist before like 22, 24 weeks, something like that. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. And we just went, hey, that's just inconsistent. It's illogical. It's unethical. And so we want to be consistent in our laws. We want to recognize that there is violence being done on someone who is innocent and vulnerable. And so it's hard.
Really quickly.
Yeah.
To point out that inconsistency, just so people are following along, you're referring the inconsistency to like if a pregnant woman was in a car accident and the preborn baby passed away, that would still be considered accidental manslaughter. So that's where the inconsistency comes up for anybody who's trying to follow the logic there.
Yeah, and so I think a component of this that I've wrestled with is what happens if we criminalize everyone except for the woman. I think what happens is that woman then becomes the scapegoat and gets further burdened with the, hey, you have to have this abortion, you have to take this pill, you have to do whatever means necessary in order to not be pregnant, to end the life of your child. Because none of the rest of us can get away with it. And so that is obviously unjust as we add a further burden onto her. But I've had some people, I mean, what's his name? Ben, what's the guy with Daily Wire?
Ben Shapiro?
Yeah, Ben Shapiro. So I've listened to some of Ben's stuff. I think Ben's a really sharp guy. He's definitely sharper than I am. So I'm not trying to prop myself up as like I know more than Ben. But Ben's position on this is that we can't prove that a woman's intent is necessarily, or that her understanding of what she's doing in an abortion is to actually kill her preborn child. She may be lied to and just told that it is just a clump of cells. And so that's where that Latin term mens rea comes from. It's sort of the intent of guilt that you're associated with in the law. It's sort of you've got the act of the crime and then you've got the intent of the crime. And so I've had some people say, hey, we don't think women should be criminalized because of that. And I've wrestled with it. And yet what I think that does is it effectively tells us that women are always victims, that women don't have an intent, that they don't have their own personal will, that they can step back and be objective, that they can make decisions of their own, that they can be unreasonable. And I think it's this weird actual pandering that doesn't really promote the dignity of women when we say, no, a woman shouldn't be criminalized for an abortion, when she is a part of an intentional killing or murdering of an innocent life. And so I know that that's hard for a lot of people to hear. I've talked with people at our church about that. They've just gone, yeah, I just can't wrap my head around that yet. And I'm fine if you can't wrap your head around it yet. However, that doesn't mean that we excuse it and that we just step back and go, oh, it's okay. So there has to be some hard wrestling in this space where we think through the implications of the policies and laws that we're asking our legislators to implement, or that we're not asking them to implement. When we step back and go, no, a woman shouldn't be guilty of murder, but a man should, and that we think through the implications of if life begins at fertilization, then that's murder. And so I don't think we need to be apologetic in calling it what it is. I think we do need to be kind and gentle as we understand that there is toxic stress often involved in these situations. But I want to be consistent. I want to be thoughtful. I want to be kind, but I'm going to hold on to the truth.
Yeah, for sure. And keeping the law consistent doesn't necessarily mean that every woman who has an abortion or who has had one would get the death penalty. That's not what it means. Yeah, it's just holding people equal across the board. And I think people jump to the assumption like, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and admittedly, there are people that are like, yes, the death penalty. And I can consistently get there. I don't think that's the intent of the law or the intent of punishment. I certainly would say, hey, we want to be restorative. When we talk about punishment, we want to be restorative when we talk about justice, that it's not God's intent to just put his thumb down on people. 2 Samuel 14:14 says that God devises ways so that banished people will not remain estranged from him, that he doesn't take away life. And so it's his intent to restore us back to him, not to just continue to lay on us and give us that pressure. And so on the flip side of this, I think there's also a reasonable approach to, hey, how do we bring about justice for the father that says, yeah, I'm not going to pay child support, or I'm not going to be involved in my child's life, or the mom's going to be left to raise the child all by herself. And how we exercise some of those things are really important. I think one thing that I would just add to this is I think every child needs to have their father's name on their birth certificate. And so just being thoughtful about some of the implications of saying something like, yes, I believe women should be criminalized for abortion. Well, we can't just pile on women all the time. We have to be thoughtful because she didn't get pregnant by herself. So that's maybe more than you asked for, but how I'd respond to that question.
No, yeah, that's awesome. Let's move on to another question that's more common in the discussion, and that's, do aborted babies go to heaven? What does the Bible say on that?
Yeah, so the Bible doesn't speak to it. The Bible doesn't tell us, yes, preborn human beings go directly to heaven. And so there's some people that would talk about things like age of accountability and those types, but the Bible's just not that cut and dry on this issue. And so I think what we can rely on is the fact that God is good, that God is trustworthy, and God is just. And so I personally, I like to think that because God is just, because God is good, that a preborn child does go to heaven, but I don't know that. And so my response to that is really just simply, we don't know, but we know that we love and serve a God that is trustworthy and that is sovereign and that is good and that is just. And we can step back from that and go, hey, God, we trust you with this. We don't know how it all works out in this specific case because we know that we are born sinful. But Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. David talks about from the womb being born in sin. And so there's some passages like that are very clear that we are, from the point of fertilization, we are born into sin, into this sinful world. But we have a God who is good and a Christ who has died on the cross for those sins. And so we leave kind of that judgment and his righteousness to him and not try and play God in this.
Yeah, so true. That idea of aborted babies going to heaven or not sort of leads into the final question we got, which is about how abortion and how that relates to miscarriage. And I'll answer a little bit here because I think first and foremost, women who experience miscarriages, that's through no fault of their own. That's not something they tried to plan. That's not something that they wanted to happen. And usually that's a very tragic, hard event. And those women feel that they've lost a child because they have. So right off the bat, a miscarriage, just like abortion, is a loss of a life, but a completely unintentional one. Yeah.
And I think just to kind of process that is going back to that whole, what's our intent, what's our involvement in it? When we talk about miscarriage, we're talking about obviously a tragic loss, and it's quite common. Miscarriages are quite common. And so I know that we've experienced that. I know lots of other friends who have experienced that, many who experience it many times over and experiencing infertility, and just tragic. And yet that isn't an intentional termination of life. It's not us inserting ourselves in. I've had friends that are like, well, when does the soul begin in a human life? And the Bible's not clear on that either. And so I would tend to say, well, from the point of fertilization is when the soul begins, that we don't believe in sort of this pre-existing soul that God drops into. That's more of a Mormon theological belief, which has all kinds of other weird implications to it. But abortions don't compare to miscarriage because there's not the intentional act to end the life, where we're not killing an innocent human being. And so anyway, talked about that a little bit before when we were talking about some of the biblical passages and SLED and whatnot. But yeah, I'm glad that somebody brought that up. We're able to kind of track that down. Any other questions before we kind of wrap up and share some resources?
No, yeah, that was all the questions that we had come in. I would encourage you guys, if you're viewing this, listening, if you've had questions come up throughout the show, definitely jot them down. Bruce will tell you in a minute how to contact us if need be. But actually, we're going to pull up a slide now with a lot of resources. So if you have a question, go check out these websites, or if you're a little bit old-fashioned, have some time on your hands stuck inside these days, check out these books. There's some really great ones with a lot of data, different perspectives, just basically an answer to any possible question you could have out there.
So Real Truth Real Quick is a really short, 8, sometimes 5 to 10 minute or so, just responses from Todd Wagner, our pastor. I mentioned Stephanie Gray on with him previously, and just some really helpful truth there. Our friends with liveaction.org, we're hoping to have Carol Novielli, who's one of their lead researchers, on in a future episode of Late Night with us. End Abortion Now with Jeff Durbin. For those of you who don't know some of that in the movie that they created, which is something like Babies Are Still Murdered Here. That's just a really thought-provoking, like, hey, what is happening in our country? Is a great resource as well that we'd encourage you to check out. Abolish Abortion Texas, if you're here in Texas, some good friends that lead that and I think are doing meaningful work that as they just think about, hey, how do we end abortion? How do we not just sort of incrementally make a difference or cut away at Roe v. Wade, but how do we actually end abortion in our state and do that in a incredibly biblical, gospel-centered way where we're consistent with what the law says and should say. Obviously, our friends at Texas Right to Life have been doing work in this area for a long time, have made a lot of progress, continue to fight the good fight, and that way we're instrumental in 2006 here in the state of Texas, where more than half of the abortion clinics shut down because of some of the work that they did in policy and legislation. I mentioned the contendprojects.org previously. They're a great resource, especially for your public schools or your private schools, to help use some of their curriculum in your middle school and high school biology classes to say, hey, this is how we know when life begins. This is all scientifically based, talking about human embryology and making sure that students really understand what's going on in the development of every single one of us. Human Coalition are some good friends of ours, partners of Watermark that we work with. They do great work across the country, both in marketing and in connecting with women and men with unexpected pregnancies that they're trying to serve and care for well. They've got a virtual clinic where they talk to women online over the phone and just go, hey, let us walk you through what this looks like. We know you feel like the sky is falling, but we want to care for you well. ProLifeTraining.com is Scott Klusendorf's ministry. We mentioned his book, The Case for Life, but Scott and his team travel the country equipping churches and community groups to think scientifically, to think apologetically. A lot of the content that we've presented tonight is Scott's content that we've just kind of ripped off or that he's taken from somebody else and improved on over time. And then lastly, as far as websites go, abortionprocedures.com is something that Live Action put together that it's a graphic depiction, sort of animated depiction of the different abortion procedures that are out there that I would encourage every single person to go see. I think oftentimes we just think, yeah, that's some medical procedure that's over there, but we've got to be thoughtful about what's actually happening to a woman's body in the life of that woman, and not just sort of put the blinders on and go, yeah, I don't like abortion, or, I think it's this necessary evil. And then I mentioned Scott's book, The Case for Life. Brian Fisher, who's the president and founder of Human Coalition, wrote a great book called Deliver Us from Abortion that we're doing some things with them to help equip the church, think about what our response should be and our culpability in all of this. And then Sue Ellen Browder wrote a book called Subverted, really talking about how the second wave feminist movement in the 60s, where women were going, look, I shouldn't be fired because I'm pregnant. I shouldn't be laid off because I'm pregnant, or I shouldn't be underpaid because I'm a woman, where she saw how some of the things that the eugenics movement was doing really started to influence the women's movement then, and kind of took it over and almost made it not about women's rights and equality, but about abortion and eugenics, and almost imposed male dominance on the women's movement. And so some really interesting things that she uncovered as she was a writer or journalist for Cosmopolitan magazine back in the 60s and 70s, that I think will really bless you as you kind of think through the nuances and complexities of how we've gotten to where we are today. Ashlyn, will you go ahead and plug the Facebook page and Instagram, and then we'll let people go.
Yeah, for sure. So on Facebook, we're Watermark Life Initiative, and on Instagram, we're just the Life Initiative. So check us out there. We've got a lot of great resource links on both of those. We post weekly on Instagram and Facebook. So either channel, whichever one you prefer, come follow us.
Love it. Yeah. So let me sign us off. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is obviously a first run at things. We're excited about what's ahead, and hope that you'll join us again in the future. If you had a question that we weren't able to get to, you can email the Life Initiative at watermark.org, or reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram, and we'd love to engage further with you there. If you or someone you care for is experiencing an unexpected pregnancy, they can reach out to our team at pregnant@watermark.org, and visit Watermark Urgent Care Clinic in Dallas or Plano. And if you or someone you know is ready to heal from a past abortion and experience freedom in Christ, email healing@watermark.org. We'd love to connect with them. We have an after-abortion care team of people who have walked through that journey themselves and have come out on the other side, not exposed, but walking in confidence and courage and the love of Christ. And so thanks again for engaging with us as we continue reminding one another that every life is worth more.